Let's get one thing straight. The Wild West you see on TV is nothing compared to the outlaw movies that studios tried to hide. Forget heroic gunfights at high noon. These are the westerns that got chopped, banned, or locked away for being way too violent, even by 1970s standards. Ever wonder what made audiences run screaming, censors reach for their scissors, and critics clutch their pearls? Saddle up. Some of these films were so brutal, you won't believe they even existed. Django Kill, If You Live, Shoot, 1967. Picture this: a gunslinger digs himself out of a shallow grave, caked in mud and rage, only to wander into a town so twisted that even the living seem half dead. That's the opening salvo of Django Kill, If You Live, Shoot, a film that redefined too much for just about everyone who saw it. This wasn't just another Italian Western, it was an acid-fueled fever dream, loaded with hallucinations, sadism, and gore so graphic it made critics queasy. Here's what drove audiences and censors over the edge. Close-ups of scalpings, townspeople slicing open a man's chest for gold bullets, and blood that looks like red paint splattered across a nightmare. When the film dropped in Italy, outrage hit instantly. Authorities yanked it from theaters after 1 week. The director was forced to slice out more than 20 minutes of the nastiest violence, but even that wasn't enough. International versions lost as much as half an hour, and some scenes were so disturbing they never resurfaced for decades. In the UK, Django Kill landed straight on the banned list and didn't get proper release until it was already a cult legend. It's hard to overstate just how radioactive this film became. Critics dismissed it as filth, while adventurous fans hunted down underground bootlegs just to see what the fuss was about. Alex Cox, a director famous for loving weird cinema, once called it the creepiest Western ever made. Today, it's a cult classic for people who want their cowboy stories with a side of surreal terror. But back then, it was the movie nobody wanted you to see. Cutthroats 9, 1972. If you thought the coldest thing in a Western was the hero's stare, you've never seen Cutthroats 9. This Spanish-American oddity rewrote the rules by dumping its characters and its audience into pure horror. A snowbound chain gang, a savage ambush, and a slow march through the frozen mountains. But what sent censors and viewers over the cliff was the violence, which didn't just cross the line, it leaped gleefully over it. Dismemberments, faces bashed in with rocks, prisoners burned alive. Cutthroats 9 delivers it all, in full, bloody color. The tone is so relentlessly grim that the movie barely feels like a Western. It's more like a 1970s grindhouse slasher with cowboy boots. Unsurprisingly, censors went ballistic. In Germany, the uncut version was banned for 3 decades. Owning a copy could get you in real trouble until 2022. The UK only allowed a heavily edited version, with the worst scenes hacked out before they'd even slap on an X rating. The film was flat-out blacklisted in Norway and Sweden. In the United States, it played almost exclusively in underground theaters and on bootleg VHS tapes, where horror fans and gorehounds swapped stories about just how sick the next scene could get. Over time, those who dared to watch started calling it the goriest Western ever made. Decades later, Cutthroats 9 is still an endurance test. Critics mostly ignored it, or wrote it off as sadistic trash, but the cult audience never let go. If you want to see a Western that makes most modern horror movies look tame, this is the lost classic you were never supposed to find. Sometimes the scariest things are hiding in plain sight. The Hunting Party 1971. Mainstream Hollywood stars, sun-baked ranches, and all the trappings of a classic Western, until the bullets start flying and the brutality leaves audiences stunned. The Hunting Party isn't your father's cowboy movie. It's the kind of film that tricks you with the promise of old-school action, then serves up a relentless barrage of shocking violence that got censors scrambling on both sides of the Atlantic. Starring Oliver Reed as a sadistic outlaw and Candice Bergen as the terrified wife he kidnaps, the movie spirals into a world of cruelty. What sets it apart isn't just the body count, but the way the violence is filmed, lingering, unflinching, and at times deeply unsettling. There's a harrowing sequence where a character is shot right through the eye, another has his throat slashed in agonizing close-up, And even animals aren't safe from the carnage, with one scene showing an on-camera slaughter that drew outrage. When it premiered, the British Board of Film Classification took one look and ordered nearly 10 minutes of footage removed. They cut the most disturbing sequences, axed the animal cruelty, and tried to soften the film's harshest edges. Even then, theaters in conservative areas wanted nothing to do with it. In the US, the film barely squeaked by with an R rating, but got quietly buried by nervous distributors. For years, The Hunting Party was a ghost in Western movie history, too violent for the mainstream, too controversial for television, and largely forgotten by critics. But in the underground, it lived on as the kind of film that leaves a mark. The lesson? Sometimes the real Wild West was in the editing room. El Topo 1970. Some movies don't just get banned, they become legends. El Topo is that kind of legend. Directed by Alejandro Jodorowsky, a man with no interest in playing by anybody's rules, this midnight movie kicked open the doors of westerns and filled the saloon with surreal violence, nightmarish imagery, and scenes that left audiences gasping for air. The story is simple enough. A lone gunslinger sets out on a bizarre, bloody spiritual journey. What happens next is anything but simple. There are shootouts, bizarre religious symbols, and violence that feels both dreamlike and shockingly real. It's a movie where nothing is sacred and nothing is safe. Jodorowsky filled the film with moments designed to provoke, scenes of cruelty, explicit gore, and sequences that still spark debate today. At one point, it's rumored that hundreds of rabbits were killed on set just to capture the right mood. But the real reason El Topo became infamous is what happened off-screen. Jodorowsky claimed in interviews that some of the disturbing acts were real, which only deepened the controversy. Mexico, where the film was made, refused to show it at all. Jodorowsky's earlier movie had already caused riots, so this one never even got a proper release in his home country. Instead, it found its audience in America, showing at midnight in a tiny New York theater. Word spread like wildfire. Rock stars like John Lennon and Yoko Ono became obsessed with it, and El Topo is often credited with inventing the entire midnight movie craze. For decades, rights battles kept it out of circulation, making it even more mysterious. Only in the 2000s did it get a real home video release. Today, El Topo stands as proof that sometimes a banned film is just the beginning of the story. Soldier Blue 1970. There's controversial, and then there's Soldier Blue, a western so raw that people still argue about it half a century later. Released at the height of the Vietnam War, this film took a real historical atrocity, the Sand Creek Massacre, and rubbed the audience's face in the blood and horror. American soldiers become the villains, mowing down an entire Cheyenne village in scenes so graphic, so relentless, that theaters emptied out, and censors went straight for the scissors. What set Soldier Blue apart wasn't just the violence, but the way it forced people to look at the darkest corners of American history. The camera doesn't flinch. Women and children are gunned down, bodies are mutilated, and the line between hero and villain is shattered. It was a direct slap at the good guy with a gun myth, and audiences weren't ready. In the US, the film barely scraped by with an R rating. Censors wanted to slap it with an X, but the studio pushed back, knowing that would kill any chance at the box office. Even with the R, many theaters refused to show it, and the film was quietly pulled from some markets. Across the Atlantic, the UK gave it an X, but even then, television broadcasts years later just cut out the entire final massacre. Critics were divided. Some called it important and brave, others labeled it exploitative. Over time, the film became a cult favorite among those who wanted their westerns with a dose of harsh reality. Soldier Blue didn't just get censored, it became a cinematic scar that still burns. Rancho Deluxe 1975. While Rancho Deluxe may not be the bloodiest western on this list, it earned its place in censorship history for pushing boundaries in a decade filled with changing tastes, and not always in the ways you expect. This offbeat, darkly comedic western starring Jeff Bridges took a sly, sometimes brutal look at the fading cowboy lifestyle, and it didn't shy away from scenes that made some theaters and censors uncomfortable. Unlike typical violent westerns, Rancho Deluxe combines sharp satire with moments of surprisingly raw violence, like a gritty cattle rustling scene that unfolds with an edge of menace rarely seen in 70s Western comedies. More than just the physical violence, it challenged the more polished, heroic image of cowboys, portraying characters with morally gray behavior, including shootouts and rough confrontations that were a bit too realistic for some viewers. When the movie was released, several states and local theaters balked at screening it uncut. Some versions trimmed scenes to reduce tension and the rougher edges of its violence, fearing that audiences weren't ready for a Western that mixed dark humor with brutality. The fact that it starred big names like Jeff Bridges and Sam Waterston only made it more surprising that the film faced pushback. While it never got banned outright, Rancho Deluxe stands as an example of the shifting landscape of Western films in the 1970s, a time when violence wasn't always loud or bloody, but still powerful enough to unsettle audiences and censors alike. It's a quiet storm of a movie that dared to show the Wild West in shades of gray rather than black and white. The Wild Bunch 1969. Let's talk about the movie that changed Westerns and screen violence forever, The Wild Bunch. Directed by Sam Peckinpah, this is the film that made censors sweat, critics argue, and audiences either cheer or storm out of theaters. Forget tidy six-shooter duels. This movie delivers two of the most infamous massacre scenes ever put on film, and it does it all in glorious, bloody slow motion. From the very first bank robbery, bodies hit the ground by the dozen, bullets tear through flesh, and the camera refuses to look away. Men, women, and even children are caught in the crossfire. The final shootout? It's a bloodbath that feels endless, with entire battalions mowed down in a haze of dust and red. Censors took one look at Peckinpah's vision and reached for their red pens. In America, around 10 minutes of violence were sliced from the theatrical cut just to dodge the dreaded X rating. But even the edited version stunned 1969 audiences. Australia banned it at first. Some European countries wouldn't touch it. Mexico, where much of the violence unfolds, only allowed a toned-down version, worried about both the carnage and the political undertones. Despite the controversy, The Wild Bunch broke box office records and forced the industry to rethink what was acceptable on screen. By the 1990s, uncut versions were widely available, and critics finally recognized the film for what it was, a masterpiece of chaos and a gritty farewell to old Hollywood. The Wild Bunch didn't just get censored, it rewrote the rules, then shot holes through them for good measure. Django 1966. If you want to know what movie single-handedly cranked up the violence in westerns, look no further than Django. Franco Nero drags a coffin through mud-soaked streets, and what's inside isn't just a prop, it's a machine gun, ready to turn every standoff into a slaughter. Sergio Corbucci's classic rewrote the playbook with violence so intense, even seasoned moviegoers were left stunned. From the get-go, you're hit with scenes like a man's ear being sliced off and shoved in his mouth, or entire towns mowed down by bullets in set pieces that feel more like war movies than westerns. Censors in the UK weren't having it. They flat out refused to rate it, banning the film completely. Django didn't officially show in Britain until 1993, almost 30 years after its release. Even in Italy, authorities demanded cuts to the infamous ear scene, but Corbucci forgot and left it in anyway, stoking the fire. In the US, Django was relegated to the grindhouse underground, far from the mainstream, playing in dingy theaters for crowds who wanted something wilder. The violence, the mud, the nihilism. It was all too much for the traditional cowboy crowd. But the legend only grew as knockoff Django movies popped up across Europe, all trying to capture the same lightning. Today, Django is hailed as a key influence on directors like Quentin Tarantino, who borrowed the name and the attitude for his own films. It's proof that sometimes the most controversial movies become the most iconic, once the dust and blood settle. A Man Called Horse, 1970. A British aristocrat kidnapped by a Sioux tribe, hung from hooks, and transformed by pain, A Man Called Horse turned stomachs and challenged taboos like few films before or since. Richard Harris stars as the outsider who endures an excruciating initiation ritual, the infamous sun vowing, where eagle claws are forced through his chest and he's suspended, writhing in agony. The sequence is long, visceral, and filmed with an intensity that makes you squirm. Audiences hadn't seen anything like it. Even Quentin Tarantino called the scene a mind-blower, the sort of thing you'd expect in a horror movie, not a Western. But the violence wasn't the only issue. The movie's depiction of Native American culture, mixing real traditions with wild invention, drew fire from activists and scholars alike. When the film premiered in Minneapolis, it didn't just stir up bad reviews. Protesters lined the sidewalks, calling it humiliating and degrading. There were bomb threats, forcing firefighters to sweep the building before screenings. Yet controversy only fed curiosity. A Man Called Horse made around $6 million at the box office, a hefty haul for 1970, and even spawned 2 sequels. Censors in several countries considered banning the film entirely, and some television versions skipped the ritual sequence altogether. But Four of the Apocalypse 1975. If you thought the Italian Western was all about cool gunslingers and catchy music, Four of the Apocalypse will knock the wind out of you. Directed by Lucio Fulci, famous for his horror films, this one takes everything that made spaghetti westerns stylish and drags it through the mud, blood, and pure insanity. The story follows a group of outcasts stumbling through the Wild West, chased and brutalized at every turn. What makes this film so notorious isn't just its violence, it's the sheer nastiness of the world these characters inhabit. There's torture, cannibalism, and a villain so sadistic he feels ripped straight from a nightmare. Scenes of brutal beatings, gunfights, and psychological torment are filmed with a sick, unflinching eye. It's not just that bad things happen, it's that the film insists you watch every step of the way. When Four of the Apocalypse arrived in Britain, censors demanded heavy cuts, chopping out some of the worst scenes. In other countries, it played in grindhouse theaters, or not at all. Critics couldn't decide if Fulci was making art or just seeing how far he could push an audience before they walked out. Over time, the movie found a following among fans of extreme cinema. It's still not for the faint of heart or the weak of stomach, but its raw style has earned it a cult reputation. If you want to see just how far the Western could go once the rulebook was burned, Fulci's nightmare vision is as far as you'll get. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, 1974. Sam Peckinpah's Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia isn't your classic Western. It's a dark, grim revenge tale, soaked in grit, violence, and a twisted sense of humor. The story follows a down-and-out piano player hired to find the missing head of a dead man, and the journey is brutal from start to finish. What really made censors squirm wasn't just the blood, but the way violence is portrayed. Raw, unglamorous, and in your face. The movie's gritty depiction of desperate people caught in a spiral of greed and death pushed boundaries. Scenes of torture, gunfights, and cold-blooded killings were intense enough to get the film banned or heavily censored in countries like Sweden and Australia. At release, many theaters refused to screen it, and critics were divided. Some praised Peckinpah's unflinching vision, while others dismissed it as nihilistic and exploitative. Over time, however, Alfredo Garcia carved out a cult following among fans of anti-westerns and dark cinema. Its bleak outlook and unrelenting violence pushed the genre into uncomfortable new territory. The film's legacy is complicated. It's a movie that almost didn't survive the censors, but ended up influencing a generation of filmmakers who wanted their westerns dirty, dangerous, and deeply human. Peckinpah didn't just deliver violence, he made it personal and unforgettable. The Brute and the Beast Massacre Time, 1966. Lucio Fulci's early western, The Brute and the Beast, is a wild ride filled with sadistic violence that shocked audiences and censors alike. It's a gritty revenge story with enough brutality to make even spaghetti western fans wince. The infamous torture scene, where the villain gleefully maims his enemies, made censors across Europe nervous. Blood splatters freely, fists fly with bone-breaking force, and the stakes feel painfully real. The film pushed the envelope on what was acceptable, forcing theaters to cut or ban it in several countries. Despite the controversy, the movie had a rough charm, blending horror-like brutality with classic Western themes. Fulci was still honing his style, but even here you can see the seeds of his future as a master of shock and gore. While it never achieved mainstream success, The Brute and the Beast lives on as a cult favorite for fans who want their westerns with a hard edge. It's a reminder that sometimes the Wild West was less about heroics and more about survival at any cost. Keoma 1976. Keoma stars Franco Nero, returning to the spaghetti western scene with a vengeance. Literally, this post-apocalyptic western delivers the expected shootouts, but wrapped in a darker, almost nihilistic tone that unsettled censors. The violence is brutal, raw, and unrelenting. Keoma's battles aren't clean gunfights. They're messy, desperate struggles that leave bodies broken and bloodied. The movie's anti-hero fights a corrupt town, but there's little hope or glory to be found. Instead, the film feels like a slow march through a violent wasteland. European censors, particularly in Britain, were wary. Scenes of torture, gunfire, and brutality were trimmed heavily before release. The grim tone and heavy violence kept it from reaching a wide audience at first, but fans of the genre embraced it as a darker, more mature Western. Though less famous than some others on this list, Keoma is a key piece in the evolution of violent Westerns, showing how the genre could blend classic elements with a modern, cynical edge. It's proof that by the mid-70s, Westerns weren't just about heroes, they were about the harsh realities no one wanted to admit. The Hired Hand, 1971. Peter Fonda's The Hired Hand was supposed to be a fresh, emotional take on the Western, but censors saw something else: rawness and violence that unsettled audiences. It tells the story of a wandering gunslinger trying to reconnect with his family, but the road is paved with blood. The violence here isn't flashy or over the top, but it's real and painful. Shootouts leave men dead or wounded, and moments of cruelty ripple through the story. Scenes of physical abuse and tense confrontations made censors nervous, especially given the film's subtle, sometimes bleak tone. When it was released, some theaters banned or cut scenes, wary of its stark depiction of life on the frontier. TV versions often toned down the violence or skipped key moments, weakening the story's emotional punch. Despite the censorship, The Hired Hand gained respect over time for its lyrical style and willingness to show the messiness of life rather than romanticize it. It's an important bridge between classic Westerns and the more violent, revisionist films that followed, proving that sometimes the Wild West was less a place and more a state of mind. Bone Tomahawk 2015. Okay, this one is a bit of a wild card. Bone Tomahawk is technically modern, but it's a brutal throwback that would have been completely banned if it showed up in the 70s. This film blends Western grit with horror-level violence, pushing the boundaries in ways that shocked even hardcore fans. The plot follows a small group of men tracking missing townsfolk into hostile territory. What starts as a tense rescue mission quickly turns into a nightmare with violence that's graphic, raw, and deeply disturbing. One infamous scene is so brutal that several viewers reportedly walked out of theaters. The violence is unflinching, visceral, and lingers in your mind long after the credits roll. Though Bone Tomahawk was praised for its performances and storytelling, the graphic nature of its violence limited its audience. Critics warned it was not for the faint-hearted, and it struggled to find a broad release. It's the kind of movie that would have been chopped mercilessly or banned outright in the 1970s. The film's reception shows how far Westerns have come and how some things never change. When violence crosses into nightmare territory, censors and audiences still recoil. Bone Tomahawk is a reminder that sometimes the darkest corners of the Wild West are best left unexplored or only seen with eyes wide open. So there you have it, the wild, brutal, and sometimes downright unwatchable Westerns that dared to push violence way past the limit. These films got chopped, banned, and buried, but their scars still shape the genre today. Which of these outlaw stories shocked you the most? Drop your pick in the comments and share your Wild West nightmares. If you loved riding through this bloody frontier, hit subscribe and keep your eyes peeled, because the darkest tales always have the most to say.